As it relates to eligibility standards, NACE does have a number of eligibility standards that a prospective or current student athlete must meet to be eligible to compete at any point in time throughout the academic year. At this point, most of NACE's eligibility standards really focus on initial eligibility, meaning the first time that a student comes in to a NACE institution and wishes to compete. And the reason for that is to essentially, from that point forward, largely defer to the individual student's institution related to what types of standards or completion of coursework that student might need to meet from an institutional perspective. So at this point, NACE eligibility rules require that an incoming student or first-time NACE participant must meet both of the following criteria. They must have an 18 on the ACT or an SAT on the 860. So that's the first criteria, is achieving an appropriate test score. The second criteria is having a 2.0, a cumulative 2.0 out of a 4.0 scale from the high school from which the student athlete graduated. So at any point in time, a NACE first-time participant must be able to show that they meet both of those standards. And that applies whether the student is a freshman in their collegiate academic career when they first compete with NACE, or if that student doesn't compete with NACE until they're a junior academically. At any point in time, the student must meet those initial requirements before that student can compete for the first time. There is one exception to those standards, and that would be that if the student only meets one of those two criteria, so let's say they only have the test score but don't have the high school GPA, then as an exception, that student could gain eligibility by earning 12 hours at their NACE institution in their very first term at that NACE institution. That would be the only exception for how a student could gain eligibility immediately if they don't meet both of those initial criteria. In addition to those initial criteria, a NACE student athlete must always be enrolled in 12 credit hours at their NACE institution to be eligible to compete. So that means at any point throughout the semester or the quarter, when there may be competitions, that student must be enrolled in 12 hours at that point in time. In addition, NACE eligibility does have a start and an end point. So in total, a NACE student can be eligible to compete for a total of 5 calendar years. That time would start from the academic term under which their first intent to compete begins. So whatever that academic term is, say it's fall of 2019, when their first ITC begins, that would start the student's 5-year clock. That clock would continue to run regardless of whether the student stays enrolled or competes or doesn't compete. It would run and it would be exhausted 5 years from that date. So in my scenario, that student's clock would be exhausted in 2024. The final note on eligibility is that in addition to NACE eligibility requirements, most publishers and publishers' events may have their own eligibility standards to compete in that event. At all points in time, a student must meet NACE eligibility requirements, whether or not they match up with the publisher's requirements. In addition, for any NACE-sponsored competition that may partner with one of these publishing events, the student must also satisfy all of those publishers' requirements to be eligible to compete.